Morning, everybody.
Good morning. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for hopping on. We have Matt Lee from Pax8 and Bern Clark from Dropsuite here to share some information with you all. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat and we'll be monitoring throughout the webinar. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. What do you say, Matt? Shall I kick us off, get us up and running?
You know what? I think definitely should for sure. Hey, Joseph Martin, what up? Sorry, saw the chat.
Yeah, the man, the myth, the legend, indeed. I feel like both. I'm sitting here in less austere surroundings and with way less of a beard, and I'm definitely a little bit of a background character, I feel like. So I think there's like, there's like three or four, I think, key themes we want to touch on today. I think there's kind of how the cybersecurity landscape has evolved and
Sure.
is evolving, and the dynamics there. And then I think there's, why things like identity protection matter specifically within the context of that. And then there's also how the role of the MSP, I think, has evolved over time, and both as the industry has evolved with the cloud, but also the cybersecurity landscape. But I mean, I guess everybody knows Matt, but I'll arguably few of you know who I am. So as Amy said, I'm Bern. I work at Dropsuite. I am the product management lead for our Entra backup product. And so that's a product that we launched with Pax8 in the US a couple of months ago in November, that we're in the process of rolling out and making available globally, which is why today we're going to touch on some things specifically about identity protection. But I think a big part of really what we want to talk about is um, the dynamics facing the industry more broadly, and the different ways that both Dropsuite plugs into that, but also just kind of how that's panning out, I think, in the broader sense. So Matt, I mean, I think when we first spoke a couple of weeks ago, you were sort of feeling very, very invigorated by the work around the CIS controls and version 8.1, which I think was available late summer of last year, August, if I
August,
remember
yeah.
that correctly.
Yep.
And so I guess that as much as anything, that's a good place to start. Is, I think that there's a lot in that document. There are a lot of things to pay attention to, and so I think maybe the audience would appreciate like your TLDR on that. Like, what does that
Yeah.
mean, to this audience? How should they think about using it? How should they think about talking about that stuff with their customers?
I was pretty invigorated yet again. I mean, I think I'm a constant string of invigorated. It's like it kind of sucks, I suppose. Yeah, take it with a grain of salt. But I was invigorated again. I taught a class on CIS through the lens of the attacker at a different place, at a hacking conference at Wild West Hacking Fest, which is mostly or Wild West Hacking Fest. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put a G on there. But
Mhm.
it's mostly practitioners in the enterprise, mid-enterprise, government space. And it was very interesting because most people in that place are NIST centric, right? They're very NIST, either 853, 171, or NIST CSF. And I had a class that was supposed to fit 12. They oversubscribed it at 20, accidentally put it up for 60. 60 signed up and were supposed to fit in this 20 seat room. And then 100 were allowed on the waiting list. But I wasn't doing that as much of a self aggrandization of that. It was just blowing my mind that many people were practitioners in CIS now. I asked people to raise their hand that actually did make it in the seats in the room. And they said, yeah, all CIS. And we're using it as a way to actually get secure, not compliant.
Right.
And I think that's the theme I would add to this is like, I like to say that CIS is the how to NIST's what. If NIST said, thou shalt have an identity management practice, CIS says, like, make a list of all the places you sign in. Furthermore, make a list of all the places that can be signed in, right? Like 6 and the extensibility of authorization systems. But the point is that CIS is becoming more and more utilized across the space, not just in the SMB, MSP, because of its practicality. CIS 8.1 makes it even easier to align with NIST. The biggest difference, I think, in my mind, is that they spoke towards the same exact language. They made the words the same for the 5 pieces. They made govern an aspect in there and started tagging some safeguards as govern. And so the biggest differences between 8 and 8.1 is the same practicality, some syntactical stupid words removed, right? Superfluous extra words, things like that. But ultimately, it's the addition of having the ability to say that's a governance-based control or safeguard, and also kind of aligning with NIST so that when you use it, they're not in odds in any way. They are meant to work well together. And so I think CIS is the best place to start. It is also the most tactical, practical, and operational for people, where it just says, go do this. Here's one thing, go do it. Now, it's one thing maybe in a lot of contexts. Like, if you say apply anti-malware and you say, yep, got it on my endpoints. What about your servers? Oh, yeah, servers too. What about mobile phones? Maybe not. What about anti-malware capabilities between your network segments? What about network devices themselves? What about IoT? How are you managing those components of it? And so CIS both starts as an easy place to get a win, rolling out that anti-malware on 10.1, but it's also one of those things that as you continue to broaden it, you understand how much more security context it provides. So I'll shut up now and let you get a word in. But yeah, that's my initial start. And what the biggest differences are between 8 and 8.1, it's really just kind of a little reshaping. The biggest difference will be in 9 long term.
Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of the conversations we have with MSPs is really the tricky part is having this conversation with the customer organization, right? Like a lot of SMBs, they're, if you kind of think about that sweet spot where, I think most people's businesses, it's, could be in that 10 to 20, maybe 30 seat organizations. They're very focused on their own business, and they're not necessarily, I want to say, like, not tech savvy. That sounds like a patronizing thing to say, but I mean, following the minutia and the play-by-play.
My plumber doesn't ask me to calculate how much of a little U-shaped thing has to be between this particular toilet and the place where the end result's going to go. Like, that's kind of his job or her job,
Right.
like, ultimately. And I think that's one of the balances we have right now as practitioners in our world is we live in between the line of where we are trusted and actual advisors, where they don't want me to explain how we're going to calculate critical mass for this nuclear explosion, and they just want it to happen and go boom. Like, at the end of the day, we're not quite there yet. So we find ourselves trying to explain to people things they don't want to learn, can't learn. Like, I went down this task of saying, okay, let's pretend like we're going to tell an executive to turn off LLMNR on IPv6. Well, first you have to understand OLLMR. That's a lookup methodology after DNS fails. Oh, DNS lookup. Okay, so you have to understand there's this domain naming system capability that happens over IP, IPv4. In this case, we're talking about IPv6. Let me explain IP. IP is Internet Protocol. It's based on So first you have to understand layer 1. Like, can you imagine the eyes glazing over of the human as you try to explain it? So we always know that at some point they're going to force us to stop explaining to them. Why do we even start? I think what I love about CIS is it's the standards. I don't have to explain it to them. It's the standards. I'm just pointing to them. And what was the best, Bernard, was when I was looking at it in this class, I had this woman in the back, and she was definitely a practitioner. I mean, she absolutely was a practitioner. It was awesome. And she's like talking to me about the challenge. And afterwards, I asked everybody in the class, hey, does anybody feel like they got something out of this, right? Like, I just need that little tiny cling to life that somebody cares about what I'm working on. But anyways, and so I asked, did anybody get anything out of this? And she put both hands on the desk, like full demonstrative. Yes. And I said, what? And she said, I can show an executive this kill chain, which was, I was asking them to align the CIS safeguards to the death that had happened to the former entity, Cisco in this case. And I can just point at the dots and explain it to my executives, and I don't have to teach them about the dots. And I think that's the best piece of this, is that when you use standards like this, you're like, I don't have to go into the technical, right? Joseph said, explain to you in technical elementary sense. Yeah, sure. But the point is, these give you things to make as reference objects that you don't have to be the smartest guy or gal in the room anymore. I think that's the piece that stands up for that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut
No,
you.
I mean, I think that's sort of exactly it, right? I mean, I think, I might play that back slightly differently, and there's like a difference between outputs and outcomes. A lot of these controls and different things that you can adhere to, they're outputs in the sense that you can check a series of boxes, but really the outcome for the customer is the ability to more safely run their business, more reliably run their business, put
Yeah.
safeguards around their ability to keep doing what they do, because they can't do what they do if the technology services they depend on are corrupted, there are outages,
Yeah.
things wrong, like however you want to describe that. And so I think, we talk a lot about the outcomes, I guess, in terms of the value of these different platforms, in the sense of like, what you want is not, this, that, and the other box checked. Those boxes
Right.
have been created by experts in order to help you understand like the right outputs that you need to deliver in order to get the outcome that you want. But
Yep.
really, I mean, as you describe, I mean, your plumber is going to glaze over if we start talking about all the technical plumbing
Sure.
that is
Yeah.
required
Yeah.
in order for his business to work. I enjoyed that pun, by the way.
Thank you.
And
Thank
so
you.
I think, there is, I think, a tendency between us in the technical field to kind of want to, demonstrate our erudition and any number of other things as part of the value we create. But it can create a protracted sales motion for customers who, they have tight budgets. They're running an organization where they're very focused on their business, not necessarily in the world because they want to buy technology for technology's sake. They want to buy technology because it
Yep.
enables them to run their business. And some of this technology is essential to doing that, but it isn't intrinsically clear what it delivers,
Sure.
particularly things that are very sort of security and management in nature. I think they kind of get the
Well,
point of those things, but not necessarily what they are.
here's why I think, and I'll attribute this. There's a female CEO that's a friend of mine of a fairly large, SaaS vendor, and she was talking to me about security, and she was asking me, "Is this enough? Is this enough? Is this enough? I'm doing this with my development team. I'm doing these things," and I'm kind of like, it depends, because that's what's cool about being a security guy or gal. You just get to say it depends over and over again your whole life. But what was great was she said to me, "Matt, the challenge with you and risk is this: as a CEO, my job is to take risk." And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, if I go into business to make profit, I take risk that I'm not going to make profit. I take
Mm-hmm.
risk that I'm going to fail, or that I'm going to get sued, or that I'm going to have people leave, or that I'm not going to grow, or that da 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 da." She says,
Mm-hmm.
"So the challenge is that you're coming to me talking about reducing risk when my whole job is to take risks." And she said it needs to be better. Which risk should I take? And that the
Mm-hmm.
conversation needs to be formed around that as a difference. So, but the point is that just remember, we're somewhat diametrically opposed when we're speaking with someone in that executive space. Their job is to calculate risks and know
Mm-hmm.
when. Because, like, going back to one of the examples I love to use is that, there's a guy that does concrete for a state of Kansas and did all the roads for the longest time before they sold their company. And back when I was helping him, I asked him, I said, "What does it take to put down and make money?" And he says, "Well, I have to have a concrete truck arrive every 30 minutes at a job site with the right mix of ash and cement and water that takes the journey and how hot it is into accordance before it gets there." Like, all that. I said, "Okay, cool. Well, how do you make sure that you have enough trucks?" He says, "Well, I have an extra truck and I have a shop and I have extra drivers and I can make sure." Great. Could you buy 100 extra trucks and would that help you? No, I only need the numbers I need. Great. Why is it with technology we don't get to that number, right? We stay well below it. We don't ever talk about it that way. We don't ever think of it that way, right? And the conversation needs to be is we need to talk about what those right risks are. And we're not even doing a good enough job of standing up for ourselves and talking in the way of business to what you said in the very, earlier of saying we need to speak about making profit, making it safe, helping you drive forward, helping enable these things. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox before I fall and break my neck here. But it was just a thought that came to mind there.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first job I out of school was at Microsoft, and that job was in their sort of business productivity solutions group, which you talk about superfluous language. There was plenty of it.
Touche.
The point of that function was, and this is just such archaeology by this point, but the point of that function was, Microsoft Office was very much an individual productivity tool, and they wanted to up
Sure.
level Office to being about teams and collaboration and organizational
Look at
collaboration.
us
Things,
now. Look at us
yeah,
now, though, huh? We're connected
fully,
to
fully
everybody. All right.
fully 21 years later, we see the fulfillment of that vision. But I mean that, in categories like that arc of time can literally be decades. But ultimately, what we're selling with that type of technology is the ability to save time doing things, and it can be difficult to pin down the ROI of that. But I think in a sort of security and resilience sense, mean, you could still boil that down to the same types of metrics, like how much time do you want to be, how much downtime are you willing to suffer? How expensive would that downtime be? Because it's not
Sure.
just, the
Those are the
lost
easy
hours of
translations.
productivity. It's you're not in business during the period of that outage. Your
Yeah.
ability to recover from something like that, small or large, you can measure the impact of that in terms of lost productivity, but also the inability for you
But
to service your market.
but there's positives too, right? And we're going to get to this in identity, but the CISO of Starbucks at this time, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago when I went to a Microsoft engineering airlift, the first one I went to, was on stage and he's talking about how we don't speak of the positives enough and we focus too much on the security. And he says, "How did I win getting FIDO tokens in their cards for all the baristas?" He said, "I didn't win on the fact that FIDO was phishing resistant and I didn't have to deal with it. I didn't win. I didn't talk about any of that." He said, "I simply posited that in our 15,000 locations and our 45,000 serving baristas at any given time, that they could sign in 13 to 30 seconds faster to their terminal and sell coffee. I was able to equate that to a number of coffee cups served in that time and made a
Mhm.
prediction that the difference would make up for itself in X, and that it would
Mm.
also serve a future profit state." I'm not saying we always get those wins, but we do need to be on the lookout for when those wins do mean something to the organization. Hey, it's faster, it's safer, it's better, it's more secure, all the things. It enables you to do what you need to do in a better fashion. A great other example of that is single sign-on. Like, for the Pax8 employees that are here or listening, we just click on stuff, like it just opens, and like we
Mhm.
know we're on that stuff. And if we don't have access to that stuff, it doesn't give us that stuff, and we don't have passwords for those things. And so when you think about that, what does that benefit to business? It's the ease of use. It's attracting employees. It's the non-frustration. It's the less tickets. I'm not waiting for a ticket for a password reset from an administrator on things. I have an identity centric, and I'm a little bit Johnny foreshadowing here, Bernard, for you on this, but that is kind of where the world's going, is a very identity centric kind of view of things.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the subject of identity protection and the protection of identity data, I think and I think it does play to that dynamic of how do we have this conversation with an end customer that doesn't understand what these things are. I
sure.
think if I picked someone who runs an SMB off the street and I said, "Hey, tell me about Microsoft Entra," I think they'd have a wide-eyed look on their face. They'd be like,
I ought to
I
do that
don't
one
know what
day.
that is,
Uh,
and I think MSPs are kind of fulfill that role. It's like, I don't know what that is. In the same way that I don't understand the tax code, so I pay my accountant to understand the tax code.
yeah,
I charge this person with making sure that they complete this thing in the right way for me so that I don't have to think about it. And I think Entra specifically falls into that category. It's a tool that you use without knowing you use it. Every time you log into something, you're using Entra, but it's invisible to you. And so talking about protections around it and those sorts of things can be tricky. And I think also there's a dynamic with Entra where Entra is a very different animal to what Active Directory used to be. And so, I talk to, any number of MSPs will say to me, like, I've never had to recover Active Directory in the past. And, I'll respond to that and say, well, you used to back up your server. And so you were backing up Active Directory,
let's say
just
I
that.
sure have. If you've never
Yeah.
dealt with a tombstoned Active Directory controller, you haven't
Yeah. I
lived,
mean,
my
I'm like,
friend.
hey,
I mean,
lucky you, great. But, past experience is not necessarily, indication of how the future is going to
yeah,
unravel. And so, you were backing it up, but also, Entra does a lot more for you than Active Directory used to do, particularly for an SMB, like all things cloud. Once the workload's in the cloud, you can consume such a richer set of functionality now that you don't have to manage it in the same way you did on-prem. And Entra is no exception to that. And so it is
sure.
now not just about being able to log into services. I mean, you mentioned things like single sign-on that help you navigate through myriad applications and what have you. And so,
Yeah.
we have a good conversation in those cases about, Entra protection being about, what the current climate is about more so than
Well,
historically. But I mean, yeah, like what's your
let's set.
perspective on the importance of identity protection and
Oh
how to have
man,
that conversation?
y'all pull up a chair, grab some popcorn. No, you have this challenge. I think of if we just went down the navigation of CIS controls. 5.6 says centralized authentication. 6.7 says you need to centralize authorization, right? In IAAA, identity, authentication, authorization, and auditing, the centralization is a key function. I mean, it's a lowest turtle problem. If you've never seen that talk before in the audience, go look at the lowest turtle. It's a conversation of where that lowest root of trust exists, right? But ultimately, if you think about trying to apply, let's say 5.2, which says, and I promise I'll get somewhere, but 5.2 says use unique passwords. I can achieve that by storing a bunch of passwords in a password manager, right? Where they're all different, they're all completely separate, and they're stored in a password manager. That's one way to achieve that. But that means that every one of those sites, in my case, when we first started on this path, it was 130 something. This was back in the MSP days. And that 130 something apps, I now have 130 authorization systems, 130 authentication systems, all with varying degrees of password management capabilities, what you can set as a password, whether or not they let you kill the old password, whether you can sign in with JWTs to email, whether you can, like, all of that, all different systems. I need to document every single one of them. But however, if I start drifting back to a single common identity source that's either SAML, OIDC flow, OAuth flow methodologies out to single sign-on resources as IDP, SP relationships, identity provider to service provider relationships, as I step into that kind of space, then I have one place to collect all my logs. I have one place to look for anomalies. I have one place to see that all of a sudden Bad Bernard is signing into 12 different things that he's never signed into before. Maybe we have an insider threat. Maybe we have way more contextually relevant data. That's why 5.6, 6.7, and the more that we can extend 6.7 into third-party apps with SCIM provisioning, right? SCIM, the ability or JIT type methodologies to bring group membership over to those third-party services and control what people can do there, then the more and the more and the more we have one single plane for change management. Wait, that might come up. One single plane for where people are, wait a minute, you might need to show somebody where your status was for users at a certain time, like maybe after 30 days of moving from one position to another. Well, maybe I could back that up. Maybe having that data and the ability to see those statuses based on those times might be valuable to me. Now, I know I'm going to make a one-to-one pitch here for you. But additional to that, the other thing I see playing out is we are becoming centrally identity centric. Like, I guess I just reused centrally, so like -1 point Gryffindor. But the thanks. But when I was doing the project The Hackening with Jason Slagle, and if anybody's on here that's part of The Hackening, I know we still owe you reports. I'm sorry if you want to catch me out back and punch me, you can. We're working on that. But we picked 56 MSPs to do a data study on. And looked at where they were as a posture. We only picked 7 of them to actually do some penetration testing on, but there's a reason for that. The 56 that we looked at, 80% had no more AD. 80% were all SaaS and core to some UPN-centric identity that's hosted by either Microsoft. Most of it was Microsoft. There were a couple of Google shops, but 99, I think, or 90-something percent, 92%, whatever the 156th is. But there's mostly Microsoft. But the point is they were all central to an Entra identity. And if you think about what I think the future is, and one of the things I think is coming for a lot of MSPs is you're probably going to have some problems with things you've already done that you cannot prove. Think about selling EDR to a medical company that had an incident 3 years ago. If it wasn't well documented or well forensically investigated, it was written off as just an incident, but you can't prove it, that you had EDR on all machines, that you had some accounting of what all machines were, that you had some reporting capabilities that you can look back upon, that you have some things. And I know this is a secondary topic, but the point is coming is the time of what you've already said to all your technicians, which is, if it's not in the ticket notes, it didn't happen. Right. And so as that starts to dawn on things like, hey, can you show me your EDR reports for that? Oh, we don't do that. The customer's responsible for that. Show me where we told the customer they're responsible for it. Oh, no, we didn't never. I mean, we're only saying it now because we know it's a problem. And like, so there's documentation challenges coming, all kinds of things. I think to your point, though, this identity centrism, this being on a core identity, the 80% of those MSPs being on the core identity, right? Means that that's the one place we can back up the group memberships that'll mean what you had access to, the accesses, the teams that you had purview to, the things that you did. That all lives in that identity touch. And anyways, I believe we're heading very, very identity centric, and we're moving a long way away from where assets are the biggest things we think about. In fact, assets, things that we use, are becoming more cattle than pets, and I'm stealing that from SUNY OU. But pets we pay a lot of money to keep around. We name them Bob. They have to be here all the time. Whereas cattle, we go, oh, that iPhone's having a problem. Let's just reset it and sign back in. Like, who's done that? Or a Google phone, right? Or switched phones, and you just simply sign in and transfer the difference. Like those types of things, they're becoming very, very ephemeral resources. And so what we're getting at is more and more identity-centric and identity-centric attacks, business email compromises, a lot of those things that are happening. And you could even see a world where you might ransom the setup of someone's environment, right? I'll go in and destroy your group memberships, remove all your stuff. And anyway, side tangent. Maybe if that ever happens, don't blame me.
I mean, I think you made some interesting points really about things like documenting the system, and there's a lot more to the requirement to document the system than just about being able to move it back to some previous point in time. It's about being able to retell yourself the story about what a system used to look like. There are simple use cases of that. I mean, you referenced Bad Bernard. Like, hopefully my mother's in the audience somewhere to connect with that statement. But that you could have an employee, you let that person go, and then 6 months later, maybe you want to rehire them, but maybe you want to replace them. And so that person comes into the organization. Your customer will say, okay, this person replaces this other person, give them all the things this other person used to have. And then you've got to ask the question, well, what were the things they had? How were they?
And that's easier in some systems when it's connected, right? Like think about Microsoft. That's easier to do when there's someone alive, right? You're like, copy all contents of bills to Bobby. But like 6 months later, not as easy. I think to your point, that would be an additional feature function that could be done if one had a backup state of that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, good hygiene would be when a user's left the organization is delete the user. Got their content backed up. That user existing in Entra, like there's just an entry point.
This conversation came up in my class yesterday. I teach a CIS class, and one of the gentlemen that was in there, he goes, Matt, is there anywhere in NIST or CIS that drives me to delete users? And I'm like, not really. In fact, disable or delete is the only methodology you get dormant users after 45 days, right? Is one of the CIS safeguards in the 5 spectrum. And it says disable or delete. Well, you might keep it for business reasons, but now you have a user that's disabled that might be taking up a license that is costing you money that you could just back up and maintain those things for that purpose and restore back when the new state is needed, to your point of rehire a year later or whatever it might be, and save $10 or $20 times 12, right? In that kind of case. So there's a reason for that, and most of it is that you need that data sometimes for business reasons. To your point, it might be we rehire this person every year, we'll just disable and delicense, but then what about the data? Does it get deleted? Are they getting more stringent on that? Anyways, side tangent, but yeah, keep triggering me. What's up, Andy?
I mean, I enjoy it. Yeah, I think, that we do see these, like, when you think about, backup systems, I think the trigger word there in backup just is like, I've got some historical data and I can revert to it, right? It's a redundancy. But, I think particularly for protection of things like Entra, like it is their documentation is at least as valuable, if not more so. The frequency by which you might need to go in and restore something in Entra might be an awful lot lower than the frequency with which you need to find an email or things like that. But this ability to discover data is important. I think it's a feature of a lot of backup systems that people don't really think about. Like I think a lot of people use our backup application to find their email because it's just easier to find it in there than it is to find it in Outlook. And the same ends up being true.
It's also out of band, which means you can hand it to different resources without having access to that system, perhaps. There's all kinds of things. Let's talk about this in a real nerdy way. Do you know the CIA triad? Anybody in the audience, or you, Bernard? What is the CIA triad? Stands for
that question in front
confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Right. And so the confidentiality, I'd like to hear more from Bernard. Okay. Eric says he'd like to hear more. Fair. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Correct, David Spuznar and Andy. And what I'm getting at is when we talk about integrity is like the state of a system. Backup mainly and principally focuses on integrity, right? Like backup for if something goes bad, that's an integrity. It also comes into availability. But it's also like, was Johnny changing the till in QuickBooks every day? And can
Mhm.
I look at that state of the time back 3 weeks ago and compare it to the state now? That's an integrity function, right? And so when we talk about cybersecurity is, yeah, sorry, Andy, a little too slow, but I did make you type and I could just talk. And I suppose if I was going to be good, I could honor Eric and hush for a minute. So Bernard, I'll let you go forward, and we'll call this an Eric tribute here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that, I mean, you are kind of elaborating on this requirement to have good documentation of the system, and I think that's a facet of backup applications that I think gets lost in the conversation. People think about, how many times have I needed to restore data, and
Yeah,
there are any number of reasons to document it that are not about restoring it. I mean, it could be, I got rid of one person and now I'm replacing them. I don't want to restore that user, but a facsimile of them, if it's readily
sure.
available, would be super valuable. But also, kind of to some of the scenarios you were describing, is that being able to see what the system looked like so that you can root cause any number of other things, like what did someone have access to at a particular point in time? Were they in a given role? Were they in a group that was some proximity for access to a certain number of other resources and things like that? But also, kind of what did our policies look like? If somebody came in, turned off MFA, wouldn't it be great to know beyond the
Yes.
lifespan of the audits for those? Hey, like somebody came in and turned off MFA, and we can prove that because we can look at a historical of the data and see, here's how this policy was configured at this point in time, and then be able to kind of track that. But that kind of documentation is valuable in the sense of, like, it enables you to go back to some previous point in time, but also enables you to understand how the system was functioning at some previous point in time,
Exactly.
particularly for things like Entra that have these integration points with other systems. It might be that your HR system, like maybe something like QuickBooks or ADP or Bamboo, any number of these systems, like where you've got something that's single sign-on in nature, where you've got that integration with the rest of the platform. There are now these dependencies between these apps. Like maybe you
Yep.
change the reporting structure by mistake, and somebody moved from sales to finance, and that keyed off access to a whole bunch of things just by virtue of there being some rule that was written around kind of how Entra was configured.
Yeah,
And
dynamic groups, things like that.
yeah, I mean, maybe the change was good in the sense that it was valid. That person did change from A to B. But the downstream implications of that could be difficult to understand, and being able to kind of look at previous states of the system and say, okay, well, here's why it was working this way, is because that's how that was configured. And I think that over time, we definitely see the role of backup applications evolving to fill some of that space. I think right now in the Entra category, there are people coming at it from the backup angle, and there are management applications coming at it from the management side of things. And so I think we see management applications that do a little bit of backup, and we see backup applications seizing the opportunity to do a little bit of management. And I think we're sort of exploring those opportunities on the Dropsuite side of things as we think about like how Entra backup can evolve over time, where you're taking regular snapshots of the system and you're providing that documentation. You could do more interesting things than just capture it for someone to go review later. Maybe
Yeah.
if your security policies change between snapshots, you want someone to tell you about that. That starts looking like a management application. There's also a capability of a backup application, and maybe you also want the system to self-heal in that regard. You want to automatically revert to previous snapshots, and and be able to do much richer auditing and compliance, and be able to like really get a clearer picture of the system state. I think we see all of those things as part of what you could do with a backup product, but are also just sort of interesting in the sense that, like, I think it's somewhat unique to Entra. But I think, in the rest of the backup platform, the ability to back up documents is also kind of unlocking some ability to add data governance and data security around those documents. If you're taking regular
Yeah.
snapshots of documents, you could say something interesting about that data and what you could do next with it. And I think, we look at our backup platform broadly as like, can we do something more interesting than just let you go back in time? Can we tell you something about the data that you're protecting, whether it's Entra or content data? And I think, over time, those cybersecurity recovery scenarios start to become a lot richer when you have both the identity and the content backed up. It's all well and good to have the content
Yeah.
backed up. You get wiped out in a cybersecurity incident, like you've got to rebuild the Entra environment first, otherwise no one can log in and access something. You've got nowhere even to put the backed up content. You've got nowhere to restore that to it. So I think we very much look at those scenarios as a way of saying, like, you, in order to recover from those things. And I think, I'd be interested in your perspective as well, in that, I think a lot of the conversation we have is that, like, I think the average person understands the impact of a cybersecurity incident, give or take. I think it's at least very easy story to tell. Someone can hack you, encrypt your data, or otherwise kind of destroy things. But I think what's trickier in this space, I think, is a lot of people feel like that's a low probability incident. But when you see the statistics, like Microsoft statistics will tell you about 70% of human or operated ransomware attacks are targeted at organizations with less than 500 seats, right? Like, they're targeting smaller organizations. Like 40% of data breaches are small organizations. And so, like, statistically, smaller organizations are targeted more so than larger organizations. My hypothesis being that it's going to be reduced friction trying to hack a smaller organization that maybe isn't reading the CIS documentation or isn't necessarily following all of that guidance. Because they don't have, if you're 5-10 people, you don't have a CISO on staff, and so your ability to kind of understand those dynamics. So I'm interested, like, in your perspective, in terms of, like, for small organizations that maybe don't see themselves as potential targets for ransomware attacks, as like how maybe, like, have that conversation to help them understand why you're conspicuous without feeling conspicuous.
It's an economics thing. I think you hit on one thing for sure, is that wherever there's less friction, people are going to go. And also, right, it's the why do you rob banks? Well, because of the money. It's where the money is, stupid, right? That conversation. But it is an economics thing. And the best way to describe this is, a friend of mine, David, had adopted or pseudo-adopted a girl in the Ukraine a long time ago. Had, kind of been like a sponsor, and was asked to come speak at her graduation, for her graduation from high school. So he did, and he took her and all her friends out to a dinner at the fanciest restaurant in the city, right? And they had the pop bottles that you can remove the top, so you have to pay per bottle, right? I mean, total all-out shindig, right? And afterwards, the girl sees the bill and is horrified that David's paying this. I mean, absolutely just horrified. She says, I can't. I'll pay you back. I'll work for the next 5 years. I'll deal with this. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. He does the math. How much do you think it was? How much was that bill in your mind? For like 20 kids.
I'll go 2,000.
No, it was $144 USD.
Really?
And so when you think about it, the economics are set up. If you think that the average family makes $30,000 combined in US dollars in that area, right, in Russia and Ukraine, and there's those areas, then all they have to do is pop one small business for $30,000, and they've done a year. So the economics support anywhere they can siphon money, whether that's business email compromises, ACHs as an encompassment of that, phishing, looking for account takeover, ransomware, extensibility, like all of that stuff plays out to where it doesn't matter. So when you go back to your why are they targeting me, the story is the economics support it. And as long as the economics support it, there's always somebody willing to take your money rather than go and dig a ditch or work in a menial job for half that money. Just the way it is. Right. And so you have this challenge. And so why are you going to be attacked? And I don't mean this is like fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I've dealt with it. I get a little bit jaded because part of our emergency response team, we took a call from an MSP out of Canada, and they are no longer an MSP. And this young person bought an MSP for $2 million, the money they'd saved up in their life and partially loaned, and lost it over a Citrix vulnerability wasn't dealt with right, and they just whitewashed over and got sued out of existence. And so you have these challenges, but small business it's a crime of opportunity, and even more so when you start looking at the attack plane is now just Microsoft. I can go get a Linode instance of IPv6 and spray against passwords until forever before I exhaust those IPs and find accounts that aren't locked. And if you don't have smart lockout on or other things, then I'm probably going to get in eventually. And so it makes it easy. You don't have to figure out what OA address. I don't have to find you and target you. I just have to find an email address and a breach log somewhere and try the password. And so when you talk about it, it's just so close and easy is the challenge. And And it's a good thing too, because now we know as defenders what battle line to draw on. It's Entra.
Hmm.
Right? We know where to protect and how to protect the identities and put in conditional access policies. We just have to get people to do it. But to your question, it's the economics of it that really drives why SMBs are so targeted, not just the configuration.
Yeah, I mean, in business speak, the opportunity cost is very low. To your point, I mean, there's any
Yeah,
number of ways to get an email address, and now you know where the endpoint is. The endpoint's in the cloud. You can't
exactly.
firewall that off straightforwardly, at least. And like Microsoft Entra data. I mean, I think in 2023 they noticed it went from 3 billion attacks a month to 30
Yeah,
billion a month, and
yeah,
it was over the course of 12 months back then. I mean, that's a billion attempts
yeah.
to compromise an Entra account, every day. And I mean, you'll wager, statistically, they'll kind of just go after whatever's there. And to your point, like they don't have to extort a lot of money in order for it to be worth it. And vulnerable, smaller organizations look more
Yep.
vulnerable. They are less likely to have the kind of policies and practices and other resources to protect themselves. And I get a text message nearly every day trying to get me to buy some kind of crypto or recruit me to some fantasy job that doesn't exist.
A
You know,
post message didn't arrive, all kinds of
yeah,
stuff.
all of those things, right? I mean, I'm an individual, so if I'm worth targeting as a person,
Yep.
if you're a two person business, you're equally at least worth targeting. And I think a lot of this conversation really speaks to how the role of the MSP has had to evolve. Like one of the jobs that I used to go through college, 25 years ago, which is painful to say that I went to college
Isn't
25.
it? I'm feeling old,
We'll,
man.
we'll move past that. I used to drive around in this tiny van going around London, just professionally rebooting things, right? Like that was my job. Working at an MSP before they were called MSPs, right? Like
Sure.
you rebooted printers, routers, servers, and then you came back again. And now it's pretty difficult to reboot a server that's in the cloud. There's a lot more sophistication to what we're doing. But I'm interested in kind of like how you'd speak to that in terms of how the role of the MSP,
Oh, yeah.
I think it changed with the cloud. You went from
Sure.
this sort of quotidian IT administration to more sort of service delivery and being service providers. And now as the cloud has evolved and we've got things like AI, but particularly the cybersecurity landscape and richer tooling around all these different things. The role of the MSP now is a sort of someone who unlocks IT value for their customers, I think has been my observation is how it's evolved.
Yeah.
Be interested to kind of just see from your perspective how you've seen the role of the MSP evolve over the last 5 years, maybe.
Sure. Oh my goodness. Especially over the last 15, right? But 5 for sure, as more people have gone one half versus the other. I wrote a book with Wes Spencer, Marnie Stockman, and Juan Fernandez, and it was talking about the SaaS. It's the MSP Owner Handbook, the SASE edition, and it really posits that there's going to be a have and have-nots more and more. Right. And if you think of it this way, if you were born 15 years ago, you definitely had Active Directory, might have even been an SBS server. All right, I'll see myself out. But you definitely had Active Directory. You definitely had on-premise line of business applications running in some SQL server or IS server, right? You were living that life. And if you were born 5 years ago or less, certainly post-pandemic, you started up an identity in Entra. You extended into this SaaS app or that SaaS app, and whether you used passwords or SSO or not might be delineable. But you didn't have a lot of infrastructure. You didn't have a lot of that earlier kind of barrier to entry of capital expenditure and management, right? But at the same time, you've seen this whole world go from literally, as you mentioned, at some point we were setting IRQ ports on cards before we plugged them in,
Mhm.
right? The little jumpers, remember that?
Oh
We
yeah, I
used to,
remember that
yeah.
well.
And we rolled up Exchange servers and we made NATs in firewalls for them. And we, right, like we did the, oh gosh, Joseph, geez, daisy chain networks. But yeah, so we were doing all of those things and it got more and more and more commoditized. Now it's a $20 license. As of what, BPOS days, it's a $20 Microsoft license and you sign in and have an account. I don't do an Exchange server. I'm not quoting you disks and RAID 10 for this and right. I'm not doing any of those things now for that. So there's a commoditization. So the first thing we posited in this book was there's an overarching commoditization that means the white glove, I'll make stuff work for you. Like Angry Birds doesn't need a white glove experience. Like I Angry Birded. I just fired up and it Angry Birds and it flappies. Like I don't need someone to help me with that. So as you see the SaaSification playing out, and as you see more and more SSO and identity become easy to script and easy to manage, there's this overarching commoditization of kind of playing out. Yeah, Electric A, I'm Matt, you're dating us who've been in the IT. Yeah, sorry, bro. It's a true story. But then you also have this backfill of people kicking sandcastles down now. Like if you went back 15, 20 years ago and I'd ask you to go to the site Information is Beautiful and search for world's largest data breaches, if you look back, there's nothing. And then all of a sudden, late 2000s, bam, it's everywhere, everything all at once, right? There might be a movie title after that. But the point is that it's all happening. So we think this happened all of a sudden. It did. Now people are kicking over sandcastles. And if you look at the rhetoric from CISA, at least, up till now, has been secure by default and secure by design. We're not secured by design. The stuff that we're building isn't safe. People that we're buying, the stuff we're buying it from isn't safe. And then on top of that, it's not secure by default. Like if I buy a car and it has an airbag, it's on by default, right? If I drive a car, it dings at me without the seatbelt in. Right? All those things started playing out that happen automatically when safety is put into other things in our lives. But in our world right now, SMBs, they buy a Microsoft tenant. It's the worst state it'll ever be in. It's not secure by default. We have to do all the work. So what some of the commodity backfill from MSPs is doing the work that isn't done on making those things secure. Hate to say that, but that is the reality. If they were just to make them more secure by default, it would be Angry Birds. I'm sorry, there's just no sensitive data there, so I love using it as a reference point. But that's kind of one of the missions that MSPs are having to solve today, all the while explaining that, yeah, this is somewhat of a new problem. And yes, to your point, Bernard, there's exposed to the cloud endpoints just ubiquitously available. There's no firewalling it. There's no protecting it. So like our job becomes backfilling that commoditization with some of that work, automating it, explaining it, guiding it, getting budget for it, getting permission for it, getting rid of tech debt. Because if you're born in the cloud, this is easy. If you're born with tech debt, we've got to bolt stuff on top of it to make it function the way we want to, or to do those things. And Matt says, I've never even touched an on-prem Exchange server. I love you with all my heart. You've never been touched by the sin that is, or an SPS server only a few times. Okay, a little touched. And everything's changing quickly. Exactly. So I think you have all these forces coming together that, to your statement, that was the best I've heard said so far, is that people have to be value and unlock the value of technology. I can go buy anything off the shelf. I was talking to another guy I'm doing a webinar with that runs the MSS conventions. And I said, what does your MSDP do for you? He said, I don't have one. He said, I just use Google and I sign into all my stuff with Google and I manage my security settings. Like, right. That's a script. Like at some point, someone will offer. I mean, you're seeing it with companies like Cloud Capsule. You're seeing it with Guards. You're seeing it with a bunch of people that are just saying, here's how Microsoft needs to be configured. And now the other point is you're entering this space because it's the next logical place. You already have the backup. You have the APIs. You have the access. That's all because of that normalization that's playing out. So I really think that the healing we've all been looking for is down the path of what we're transitioning into. And the people over here either lose the business, change, or grow into that space, especially in the SMB, and especially with code consuming entities as opposed to code producing entities. Now, that still follows the same track. It's just a different conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned things like the pandemic as well, which, it's almost easy to forget because it was such a surreal point in time, and we're back to normal, but also
right?
We're not. Right. I think we're able to mingle and go outside, but how we work, where we work, the tools, devices, all of those different things did fundamentally change. I mean, I didn't 25 years ago when I was rebooting servers, I wasn't worried about people wandering off to some unsecure Wi-Fi hotspot. I wasn't worried about someone sitting in an airport on a Wi-Fi hotspot and having someone stealing their browser tokens because that Wi-Fi is not encrypted, and there's nothing like protecting that data as it goes across the wire, and that ability to kind of track those things and then hijack someone's identity. I mean, we didn't have to worry about those things because, not just that the technology was more primitive, but people were not working in those kinds of modalities. They weren't picking their laptops up, wandering to coffee shops and doing other sort of mercurial things with their devices. And so, as technology providers, we have to evolve with those use cases, and we have to say this is how your workforce functions. Some people work predominantly in an office, like Dropsuite, we work predominantly remotely, but everybody is on some level working outside. Like they're not working within a corporate network, however they're working in most cases. They're connected to the cloud. They're connected through public endpoints, and they could be many devices, many different ways of doing that. And so being able to make sure that, like, one, you're telling a good story about how to do that in a secure and well managed way, so that you can tap into the benefits of that type of technology without having to take on all of the risks, or at least manage the risks. I think is an important conversation for the MSP to have, in addition to, hey, do you know what the technology could be doing for you? Because you don't know what Entra is, but I do, and it can do things that that are going to be valuable to your business. And so, like, I think the role of kind of explaining, like, what the value of IT can be for your, like, what technology can do to empower your business is an important one to be able to have. And I think one that we see differentiating certainly MSPs from each other. And you mentioned the haves and have nots. I think some part of that is, if you're able to sell value versus, here are boxes you need to have checked, and you've got a begrudging buyer versus a enthusiastic value driven buyer, then I think you get a much different dynamic in terms of how you're servicing your customers and winning business.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And somebody else, Matt, just commented, I graduated in 2019. Remote work's all they've known. So many companies are going BYOD, which is adding complexity. But in the same breath, when you think about what a world built 100% on Entra and extensibility and SSO of other applications would mean, is that when you talk about BYOD, you can control what they have access to on BYOD, right? Because of the granularity of conditional access. You can say, you can access these non-sensitive things from here, but sensitive things here, you have to get to another. Another question that just came in is, what about turning on security defaults in Entra? Okay, trade-off, right? Andrew, at least my opinion, and Bernard, if you want to jump in on this too, says, what about turning on security defaults in Entra? I like it as a step up from nothing. I think. I think the challenge is that the granularity isn't there when you have security defaults. Once you go down that path, you can't make granular decisions against that path. It would be better to get you to a place of where you want to be from that perspective. Partly that's a decision of Microsoft with the way they templated the defaults, just turning on. Now they start to apply a default set of policies in conditional access that are pretty good, right? So that gives you that granularity again, where you can start messing with it. What are your thoughts on that, or any of the other questions that came in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I would agree, security defaults are much better than unsecure defaults. I think having,
Fair.
having something that is locking that down is in many ways important. But I think in some cases they can be limiting and draconian, and particularly if you've got, like, legacy infrastructure, right? Like, what if your scanner needs an SMTP endpoint that they can get at through basic auth, right? Like, some of these things, you need to open something up, and you need to be able to do it in a very measured and controlled way. It's like, yes, we can open up an endpoint that maybe, some part of that is intrinsically insecure, insofar as, like, you wouldn't want to do that broadly, and the protocol itself doesn't have that security by design built into it, but you have some business need to go do something. And also, to your point, I mean, the security defaults only go so far, and we were talking about, like, the rich and diverse ways that people use devices and the places they use them from, and the ability to kind of have some adaptability there to make it easier on the end user, right? Like, I think the thing that always gets lost in any kind of technology implementation is the point of failure is how well the end user uses it, right? Like, CRM systems always used to fall into this category. People spend millions of dollars on a CRM system, not get any value from it because nobody used the CRM system. The security controls fall into a similar category, as if you make things too difficult, people start to find ways to make it easy on themselves, and those ways are often circumnavigating the security of that. And so, you mentioned things like single sign-on, like, it makes it very easy to access resources. And so, like, reducing the friction of using technology is important. And the ability to kind of set different policies and security controls that say, like, hey, if you are in some particular IP address that we know is secure, like, we won't have you mess around with the authenticator app and all these other things that maybe frustrate you, that are necessary to keep your data secure, but frustrating when you just want to open a URL or sign into Outlook or whatever it is that you're doing. We'll kind of, enable some granularity in those controls to, like, reflect, like, how you're trying to use the technology and make it easy whilst also maintaining security, and the ability to kind of strike a better balance, I think, it requires you to go beyond what the security defaults give you.
Matt actually in the chat asked you to give an over of Entra backup, please.
Yeah, I mean, in the couple of minutes we have there, that's somewhat of a tall order. I mean, what I would say is that for anyone like who is a Dropsuite partner, or anybody who isn't should certainly register to become one, is that right now we have the non for resale licenses available for everything Dropsuite Entra backup, so everybody can go start using the product for themselves, and so that's definitely going to give you a much better understanding of the product than I could give you, certainly in the 30 seconds or so that we have left. But with today's version of Dropsuite Entra Backup, we support like the essential stuff, which is like the users, the groups, and the roles. But we're on a path through this year, the first half of which is to add full coverage for all of the stuff that you get in all versions of Entra up to plan 1. So like all the stuff that you get in business premium, we'll add protection for the Intune and also the security and compliance policies that you have in there. So that's our goal over the next couple of months, is to get full coverage of the stuff that you're selling with business premium. And then through the rest of the year, do more of these like governance and auditing capabilities that I was talking about earlier.
So if I understand you correctly, initial backup of those things with broadening capabilities and long-term potentially governance and reporting of those things. And I think that's the good thing to close on is every time I teach a class on CIS controls, if you can't prove it, right, I go through an exercise of the what, the how, the tool, and the proof. If you can't prove it, it didn't happen. And governance is just that, the ability to not only give the will of the organization down to have it happen, but the monitoring of the organization to ensure it did happen. And I think that that's an awesome path forward. So very cool. And that went by really quick, didn't it? I mean, goodness.
It did. We're 56 minutes all of a sudden.
All right. Any final questions or thoughts from anybody in the audience? What are some good ways to follow you guys and learn more? Andrew asked. Bernard, you want to start first? Or Bernard, you want to start first?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly, I think, get a lot more value following Dropsuite on the socials. So you following us particularly on LinkedIn, you know, you can keep up with a lot of stuff that we're doing there, as well as following me personally. But I think like us as an organization are saying more eloquent and profound things than I am as an individual, possibly in contrast with you, Matt, who
whatever.
You proliferate pearls of wisdom in across a broad range of
I'll put that bait out there. Yeah, same, right? cybermattlee.com or cybermattlee on anything. Pax8, we have several different ways you can catch up there. The other thing I'll give a little bit of feedback on from Dropsuite, and I'll say, and I'm not compensated for this, I've been a believer in Dropsuite and user of Dropsuite since like 2000, probably 14, 15. And I will also say that I've been privy to a lot of your engineering discussions of how can we add more value? And the answer has always been, Bernard, exactly what you said. More at the identity layer, more context of the identity and its access to the things that we're backing up. Like you're starting to see a world where you can become the DR for cloud. You can become the things that allow you to go function, gain context, gain information, gain names, gain things you need in an outage or in a downtime. And so just some very interesting things playing out there. So I'll put in a personal Matt Lee vote for Dropsuite, which I don't do very often. So anyways, just thought I'd close with that.
Yeah, well, we appreciate that. Well, I think we're up on time, and so I think if anyone's got any other questions, certainly for me, you can certainly get me directly at bernard@dropsuite.com. We're at least very easy to find in that regard, so you can certainly reach out. There was a question there about Ninja One, which is obviously like a broader question. I think my simple answer is no changes expected. You know, we're on a path to innovate our platform, and part of that acquisition is to enable us to innovate even faster and harder in that capacity. So I think you should see that being an enabler of what we're doing in our business. So I'll sort of cover that one quickly, but any others that maybe come up after the fact, do feel free to just drop me an email. And if I don't know the answer, I can certainly find someone who does.
All right. Well, thank y'all all for being here. Amy, we'll hand it back to you and let you close us out.
Yeah, no, just want to say thanks, Bern. Thanks, Matt, for the time. I think this was really great. If anyone wants access to this recording, reach out to your CSC or your CAM. They'll be able to send it out, and appreciate the time, everybody, and the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.